Welcome to the Kriya Yoga Podcast, a source of inspiration and actionable education for those inspired towards the goal of enlightenment through yogic meditation. Through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share the possibility of waking up to the reality of self and God realization, and to remind you of the immortal words of Paramahansa Yogananda. Don't look back. Don't look to the left or to the right. Look straight ahead to the goal and go all the way in this lifetime. I'm Ryan Kurzak, and I'll be your host on this adventure of spiritual self-discovery. What is the actual possibility of self-realization, of becoming self-realized in this lifetime? This is a question that was recently posed to me. And in order to answer it, we need to consider a few terms. Number one, what is self-realization? What does that even mean? We know that Paramahansa Yogananda, his organization was called the Self-Realization Fellowship. And we know that through the practice of Kriya Yoga and the practices within the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, we are meant to experience self-realization. But what is that? Well, self-realization in the context of yoga relates to that aspect of us which is eternal, immortal, and can sometimes be compared to our ultimate spiritual nature. So the self in self-realization, we would use a capital S, self, not the little personality, but self as in the bigger you, the infinite you, the you which exists through all things, at all times, that consciousness which pervades every experience that you've ever had or will have. And self-realization is an unqualified, aware, present state of being. It's often used as a synonym for enlightenment or nirvana or atma jnana. And self-realization occurs when one is awake and aware of one's timeless essence, free of any identification with thought, emotion, memory, object, or feeling. Now, that doesn't mean that a self-realized person can't have thoughts, emotions, memories, perceptions, or feelings. It means that they're not identified with them. They're not defining themselves through that experience. Now, one of the core processes and purposes in yoga is the ending of something called vrittis. And vrittis are activities or fluctuations and changes within the field of consciousness. So a person is said to be self-realized when these vrittis, these activities in consciousness, have subsided. And essentially, the system of yoga was developed to encourage a repeatable procedure to experience self-realization. That's why we practice yoga. That's the ultimate reason that we engage in the yamas and niyamas, asana practice, pranayama practice, and deeper levels of meditation. And how do we come to a place where we can actually experience and recognize self-realization, that we are self-realized? Well, we have to go through all 8 limbs of yoga. We have to apply the yamas and niyamas, the moral principles and the restraints. We have to learn to sit still, to turn our awareness within through asana. We have to learn to breathe in such a way that the energy of our body, the energy of our minds, the energy of our emotions are balanced and free-flowing. That's pranayama. And once we've gotten a handle on these levels, we learn to direct our attention inwardly to practice dharana and dhyana, which is essentially focusing our attention, learning to bring our awareness into a unified, focused point, a one-pointedness, so that we're not distracted by everything. So essentially, it's a release of distractions. And this results in an experience called Samadhi. Now, Samadhi is a very abstract and sometimes difficult to translate term. It's been translated as cognitive absorption, but really it's a state when you are so absorbed in an experience that you are aware of nothing else but that experience. And you've probably had this or had a similar experience unconsciously But the purpose of yoga is to learn to experience this cognitive absorption consciously. And samadhi ultimately is the culmination of a structured approach to meditation. And this structured approach encourages one-pointed focus. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, in chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, it said that dharana is a fixation of the field of consciousness within a focal point. So once you've learned to practice the moral disciplines and the restraints, once you can sit still and practice pranayama, then you turn your awareness within and you focus the field of consciousness, you focus your awareness on a focal point. To some people, that'll be a mantra. To others, it'll be an extended version of pranayama. It can be a form of contemplation. And then when that becomes singular, when you're able to hold your attention there and keep it there, then you're essentially practicing meditation, because then the field of consciousness is reflecting that chosen focal point alone as if empty of its own form. And this is said to result in cognitive absorption or samadhi. And this takes some work. This takes some time. This takes some effort. Many people who want to popularize their philosophy or their approach will often tell you that this is easy if you just find the right technique. But like all things in life, you should know better than that. All things that are worth doing take time, attention, effort, practice, and sometimes many, many years. But it's accomplishable. It's doable. That's the reason we have the system of yoga. That's the reason that we have a lineage of teachers who have experienced this themselves, learned to navigate it themselves, and are able to share that information so you too can navigate the realm of yoga to experience samadhi, or to navigate your inner consciousness so that you can finally experience this state of cognitive absorption, this state of oneness and clarity and inner peace. Now you're going to hear me repeat this a lot, and this is discussed in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, that samadhi, even though it is a culmination of the practices of yoga, it requires a constant engagement in the previous limbs of yoga. So we have the 8 limbs of yoga, yama and niyama, the moral observances and the restraints. We have asana, and you're able to perfect your asana when you have an effortless meditation posture, when your meditation posture no longer troubles you. You can simply breathe, turn your attention within, and let the body go. There is pranayama, which are breath practices, breath awareness, which again harmonizes and balances the mental and emotional field of your being. Because if you're expecting to experience spiritual realization or self-realization, there has to be balance within you. And that is the primary purpose of pranayama. Then there is pratyahara, the ability to turn your attention within. And since meditation is an internal process, if you can't turn your attention within, you're not likely going to meditate very well. So all of these things come before we get to actual meditation as it's described in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And so if you want to be able to actually experience samadhi in a very real way, authentic way, you do have to work and essentially perfect these previous 5 limbs of yoga, because the next limbs, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, again, as I mentioned, these are the internal limbs. So you have to be able to be balanced, you have to be able to turn your awareness within, and you also have to be able to follow these vows, the moral principles of the yamas and the niyamas. And essentially, samadhi cannot be accessed without this. Sure, you can put yourself into a temporary state that seems like samadhi through certain types of breathing or other methods, but that's not actually samadhi. That's just the body being put in a particular situation that consciousness essentially isn't functioning as well as it could. And so it seems like all the fluctuations and changes are stilling when they're not. It's just the body. And samadhi, the experience of samadhi, is beyond the body. It can be experienced while you are in a body, but samadhi is cultivated through your consciousness. The body helps, but in order to have a repeatable, transformational, supportive experience of samadhi that results in self-realization, you have to follow the steps. You have to follow the procedures. Otherwise, you're just going to be hypnotized by spiritual fantasy rather than experiencing an authentic process of spiritual realization. Now, in order to experience samadhi and spiritual realization requires a choice. You have to decide that it's important to you. You have to choose to direct your activities and attention to cultivating that choice. And samadhi is accessible to anyone who's capable of putting forth the appropriate effort and has the capacity to appreciate transcendent states of awareness. And that capacity to experience transcendent states of awareness that accumulates through your spiritual practice. Activities that encourage an experience of samadhi, these can be learned from knowledgeable teachers and also authentic sacred texts. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, for example, contains a very specific map of the activities and how to navigate the experiences internally so that you can actually recognize samadhi when it happens and then help it grow, cultivate it. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because many people take the possibility of samadhi on faith. They believe it's possible, but they may never come close to experiencing it in their lifetime, and so they never really fully appreciate the potential of the practice. And some might touch it every now and then, but they never learn to actually stabilize the experience. And so then they think, oh, this state of samadhi really is dependent on luck, wishful thinking, or fickle grace. And this isn't the case at all, because yogis from time immemorial have benefited from a tradition and a step-by-step procedure which can and does lead to a repeatable experience of transcendence. And that is the purpose of Kriya Yoga, and that is the purpose of the text, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It's also the purpose of Sri Yukteswar's text, The Holy Science. And I've been surprised by the attitude of some modern yogis, people that teach yoga. It seems that they feel uncomfortable with the idea that you can learn samadhi and experience samadhi the same way that you would learn an asana pose. And many people who practice physical postures, physical hatha yoga, they can do some pretty amazing things with their body. And that takes time, that takes skill. Compared to someone who doesn't try at all, it seems amazing. But the same is true for this experience of samadhi, this internal yoga. Through practice, you learn how to do it. And compared to people who never really try or who never really take the time to figure out the nuances of it, it also seems amazing. So I've been very surprised when I've learned about very committed and experienced yogis who consider this reality of samadhi to be more of a myth than anything. And this experience of samadhi, as I mentioned, and we've talked about many times, it requires a very focused and specific set of activities. So there's a lot more required of a yogi to experience samadhi than there is just to simply move into an asana pose, like Warrior 2. That's got its place, but samadhi is a very abstract and nuanced experience. However, these ancient texts that we have and these traditions that we have, they all affirm the reality of samadhi as a repeatable and accessible experience. So as a yogi, if the source material and your teachers, those that you look up to, those that are spiritual role models for you, if they discuss this possibility of samadhi and they say that it is very possible to experience, why would you doubt it? And just because samadhi requires a certain precision, accuracy, and determination to experience, that doesn't mean it's impossible. And we shouldn't treat people who have actually engaged that precision, accuracy, and determination, we shouldn't treat them suspiciously. It's like when you've known someone who has worked very hard at becoming skilled at long distance running or some other extreme feat, physical feat, and you've never really tried it yourself. You say, oh, well, they've just got good genes. When really, they got up every morning and they did what it took to learn how to do that. The same is true for this whole experience of samadhi and yoga. Now, there's a really wonderful book by Vyas Houston, the director of the American Sanskrit Institute, and the book is called Yoga Sutras, The Practice. And there's a really inspiring quote from that book that I love. He writes that there seems to be a persistent belief among us that the various states of samadhi, let alone nirvana or kaivalya, described in ancient classical texts on yoga are unapproachable. For thousands of years, before the more recent age of worldwide commerce, industry, and technology, this was not the case. In the vast body of sacred Sanskrit texts, as well as vernacular literature, we see a continuous outpouring of unbounded enthusiasm and encouragement, a seemingly endless reservoir of inspiration from countless enlightened sages, generation after generation. The expectation of spiritual illumination was high because the ancients had found not just a specific way, but multiple pathways to the transcendence of time and space. Now, despite my surprise at the attitudes or beliefs held by a lot of modern yogis that samadhi is unattainable, it's understandable for a few reasons. Number one, samadhi is a subtle experience in the same way that spiritual realities are subtle. And many imagine the experience of refined states of consciousness or spiritual realities to be hyper-real, or a cartoonish replica of everyday life, filled with life and a peculiar absence of gravity. Now, if we're having an internal meditation experience of this nature, it is simply another symptom of agitation in our minds. And sometimes these perceptions, they can help inspire us on our inward journey, but they're still mind-produced phenomena. Spiritual experience is beyond the mind. If we've never known anything other than the contents of the mind, samadhi seems inconceivable. Now, the beauty of yoga is that it can reveal to us what is inconceivable. Yoga is a mystical path. Through engaging the practices, we are introduced to aspects of ourselves that were previously unconscious. And these aspects are also relatively unimaginable. Imagine a canine or a dog suddenly becoming aware of the capacity of the human mind. To a canine, the inner landscape of human consciousness can't be imagined. And if a canine consciousness suddenly perceived reality as a human consciousness, would it know how to function, or would it have any context for what it was experiencing? In this example, canine awareness is our current condition, and the experience of human consciousness is the experience of spiritual realities. So the realities of spirit, while they are always influencing and informing our limited human consciousness, they cannot be imagined. They have to be experienced gradually. And it's the step-by-step route of yoga which allows this to occur. Now, many of you are familiar with Ramana Maharshi. If you've seen any of my videos on YouTube, you have seen this big poster behind me. One of them is of Roy Eugene Davis, my Kriya Yoga teacher. The other is of Ramana Maharshi. And his story, Ramana Maharshi, his story of sudden awakening, that speaks to us on several levels. On the spiritual level, it calls us, it stirs that profound divine love to remember our true nature as self and infinite spirit. On another level, it can awaken a childlike demand to be gratified immediately with divine perception. And the unfulfilled youth within us demands that some cosmic mother or father satisfy our spiritual ache without any kind of delay. While Ramana Maharshi did encourage devotees to go straight to the source through inquiry to know the self now, he was also aware that most of us need to mature and grow through stages of awareness before any contemplation or profound inner reflection would actually bear fruit. And this is the place of Kriya Yoga. Kriya is a Sanskrit word that implies action and activity. The Kriyas, or the activities, of authentic yoga practice carry us to that realization that sages like Ramana Maharshi and Paramahansa Yogananda, that they embodied. Another reason why the possibility of samadhi seems doubtful for many is really due to lack of context. And this is what contributes to the difficulty of understanding the process of yoga. And context is provided by an understanding of the principles outlined in texts like the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And if you've not studied the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, I'd like to recommend my commentary from the book Kriya Yoga, Continuing the Lineage of Enlightenment, and also Roy Eugene Davis's commentary called The Science of Self-Realization. So if you can find those books, that'll help to put this whole process into context. And there are many basic yoga principles that can be understood from a casual reading of the Yoga Sutras. It's easy for us to grasp the need to practice truthfulness, an aspect of the second limb of yoga, or it's easy for us to understand how pranayama or breath work is important, or why it's important to direct our attention within through pratyahara. These are obvious and they're helpful. They're going to bring us an improved sense of well-being and a degree of inner peace and relaxation, and these are benefits of yoga. And they should be taught to everyone, not just in yoga studios. The essential foundation of yoga, these processes we're discussing, they can and will harmonize the collective consciousness of humanity. And they will enable people to find meaning in this life that they're living. And they'll find meaning in a way that they can approach life with grace and poise. And most people approach yoga not for spiritual awakening, but really to have simply a more comfortable life. However, deep within the structure of the Yoga Sutras is a method of accessing subtler and subtler states of consciousness. That's the ultimate goal of practice. And in order to recognize this information, you need either a very clear and informative book to explain it to you, or you need someone who is able to interpret the sutras in a way that they can share what is most important to your own unique spiritual path. And both of these are actually kind of rare. They're as rare as the practitioner who's actually fully inspired to take yoga practice to its completion. Now, another difficulty that can arise is resistance. It prevents the acknowledgement of the possibility of samadhi. This can arise due to psychological distress or fear, or simply being overwhelmed by what is required for a complete yoga practice. So it's not uncommon for us to become defensive or resistant. And what we need to do is master the willpower to learn and release any sense of shame for not having all of the information, or feeling of being less than because we look at the requirements of yoga, and at our current stage, we might not feel that we have the capacity to do it. But if we can learn to overcome that, to move through it, and just take one step at a time, then a lot of the resistance can dissolve. And then one can really engage in inner growth that's transformational for them. You know, often we feel like we don't have the capacity to understand more than we already know. So when information is presented to us that requires us to stretch beyond our capacity for knowing, we usually shut down. And part of the yogic path requires deep contemplation and introspection. So to succeed, you have to overcome the fear of learning more. You have to overcome the fear of expanding your consciousness. And one of the most enjoyable, yet sometimes difficult part of the path is learning to abide in states of mystical unknowing or wondering. You know, some of these texts and teachings are abstract. They require months or even years of contemplation to grasp. And so if you have an enthusiastic openness to learning, your resistance can easily dissolve, and any kind of psychological distress of being overwhelmed, you don't have to worry about it, because you move more into a state of wonder and curiosity than resistance. And often the process of yoga is counterintuitive to what most people think leads to happiness. Now, if we look at chapter 2 in the Bhagavad Gita, verses 64 and 65, it says, "But the devotee whose mind is disciplined, who moves in the world with the senses under control, and is free from attachment and aversions, and is established in tranquility, that purity of spirit removes one from all sorrow." The knowledge of the devotee is soon firm in permanent peace. And verse 69, what is night for all spiritually unaware beings is the time of wakefulness for the disciplined devotee. For the one who sees clearly, what is the time of wakefulness for ordinary people is night. In these verses we see that discipline, control, freedom from attachment, the resolution of aversions, this is indicated to result in tranquility and peace. And this is not how most people think. It's likely the reason there's a lot of preventable suffering in the world. So we see that what is night for spiritually unawake beings is the time of wakefulness for the disciplined devotee. The sacred text, the Gita, tells us very directly that the priorities of one on the spiritual path is often contrary to the priority of others. So despite a deep intuitive knowing that our ultimate well-being is assured through an intentional and committed engagement of the yogic path, we may be unwilling or afraid to engage life differently than our peers. And we would rather continue swirling in this massive suffering because at least there we're not alone. We'd rather do that than to step onto a more meaningful, if not more solitary road. Now, one of the other reasons that there can be some difficulty or resistance to samadhi and self-realization is a very real danger or fear of being misled. It's a very valid fear. And there's no shortage of well-meaning, and sometimes not so well-meaning, spiritual entertainers who can convincingly assure us of their gifts of spiritual realization. They spin their tales and they drain us of our resources and time. And once their charisma or well-crafted language wears off, we find that we're depleted of faith and enthusiasm. And that's not a very pleasant place to be, especially for one who's sincerely trying to wake up, sincerely trying to practice yoga and experience self-realization. However, if we're fortunate to have a deep inner calling to look beyond this endless cycle of pleasure and pain that defines our human experience, if we know deep down inside there's more to our being than this light and shadow, through true faith we learn to rise above these snares of fear and ignorance. And by engaging in the yamas and niyamas, we encourage psychological health. And this psychological health is necessary for higher yoga practice, but it's also necessary for us to have the strength to not be fooled by misleading people. Most of the time, we are fooled by misleading people because we don't trust our gut, or because psychologically we don't really have a belief in ourselves, or maybe due to childhood experiences we've been manipulated in ways that aren't beneficial to us, and so that leads us to be manipulated by others as we're adults. And so learning to develop this psychological health through a practice of the yamas and niyamas, this in time, along with our intentions and heartfelt prayers, can bring us into the realm of an authentic teacher and an authentic tradition. So this is why we often have to do a lot of preliminary work on ourselves. That's why they say when the student is ready, the teacher appears. When the student is not ready, teachers may appear, but they may not be the most helpful people for you on your spiritual path. But again, this can be overcome. This can be resolved by becoming as psychologically healthy as we can be, by becoming in touch with our gut and our inner intuition and our inner strength. So by cultivating that will help this whole process. Now, to return to this issue of context, the Yoga Sutras are based on the cosmology of Sankhya philosophy. Not only do modern yogis have the disadvantage of only having access to the surface content held within the Yoga Sutras, most also lack the context of Samkhya, which really enriches the meaning of yoga practice. So it's for these reasons, it's really no surprise why the experience of samadhi should seem almost impossible, barring luck or grace. The capacity to appreciate transcendent states of awareness, these can be cultivated through yoga practice as outlined in the Yoga Sutras and through teachers within the Kriya Yoga tradition, and also having a background information of Samkhya philosophy, this will help to make the model complete. It will help to encourage proper integration of what is experienced during transcendent states of awareness. And if you read the Bhagavad Gita, there's references to Samkhya. If you read Roy Eugene Davis's books, such as The 7 Lessons in Conscious Living or Absolute Knowledge or other books, he refers to Samkhya philosophy multiple times. And there's a reason for this. It's because these principles of Samkhya, they really give access points which can anchor our contemplation during times of mystical unknowing. So anyway, there are several challenging obstacles which can really deter us from uncovering this immortal treasure of yoga. And these obstacles can be resolved. And in the overcoming of the obstacles, you, the yogi, become spiritually strong and resilient. And then you become knowledgeable and wise. So the question is really, are they obstacles, or are they just part of our self-realization path which prepare us to dive deeper into more subtler and abstract spiritual realizations? So these are some things to contemplate, but ultimately realize that self-realization is absolutely possible, that the experience of Samadhi is absolutely possible. You just have to set up the right foundation and organize your life around the principles of yoga, and realize that it may be that your direction in life could be very different than everyone else's. Where most people are getting engaged in one more distraction, one more thing to do, you're learning to become calmer, more settled, more internalized, more intentional, more focused. You're learning to become less distracted in life. And the better you can do this with every area of your life, the easier meditation will reveal to you, again, these subtler and more abstract experiences that are accessible to you as a yogi, as a practitioner of yogic meditation. So study the Yoga Sutras, practice what you learn. Learn transformational, effective meditation techniques from an authentic teacher and an authentic lineage, and practice those things with faith and devotion. Study the Bhagavad Gita and other sacred literature that inspires you, and then learn to live from that state of consciousness that they embody, these texts embody. And if you can do these things, as time goes on, as the years go by, you will feel and recognize that you are either directly experiencing self-realization, catching glimpses of Samadhi, or stabilizing an experience of Samadhi regularly in your meditation practice. And that's ideal.